They turned my grandfather's bridge into driftwood at sunrise, so I turned their $6 million 0 cents resort into a swamp using one rusty valve. That's not an exaggeration, that's what happened. It started when the HOA demolished my grandfather's bridge. 6:00 a.m. sharp. Chainsaws howling like sirens, 40 years of family history splintered into the lake, while their president stood on a marble balcony, sipping champagne in designer heels like she was toasting a war victory. But here's what she didn't know. That bridge? Just wood, nails, and memories. But the water under it? That was mine. Every legal, documented, non-negotiable drop. So if you're watching this at work, do yourself a favor. Drop a comment before your boss walks by. Because I'm about to show you how one pissed-off mechanic with a wrench, a grudge, and a $12 0 cents valve turned a luxury resort into the most expensive swamp this side of the Mississippi. I've spent most of my adult life elbow-deep in carburetors and busted transmissions. Monroe Auto isn't just my shop, it's my sanctuary. Out here, machines make sense. They don't lie, they don't fake smiles, and they don't send you HOA violation notices signed in purple ink. My land sits at the edge of Crystal Creek, a patch of peace with trees older than the town and water so clear it practically sparkles. And right across from it, Crystal Lake Resort. A fake paradise with chemically treated turf, imported palm trees, and a man-made lake so murky I wouldn't wash my dog in it. They sold natural beauty with a brochure and a straight face, but the moment their koi started floating belly up while mine swam like royalty, I knew something was off. Turns out, you can't pump luxury into a place that's been built on a lie. The warning came before the sawdust. I was picking up groceries when I heard a voice behind me mutter, "That Monroe kid still thinks he owns the whole creek." I turned around and there she was. Victoria Caldwell in full HOA regalia, pearls, power walk posture, and that unmistakable look of someone who thinks your family legacy is a zoning error. She smiled like she meant it, but her eyes told a different story. The next morning, a letter showed up. Not an envelope, a dossier, 3 pages of HOA legalese with a handwritten note at the bottom. This especially applies to unauthorized bridges. Signed, of course, in violet ink. That's the HOA version of a middle finger. Funny thing is, my property isn't even in their HOA. My land was here before their Y-laws, their welcome signs, and their wine-tasting Wednesdays, but apparently history didn't matter anymore. Later that evening, I sat on the dock with a beer in one hand and my fishing rod in the other, trying to shake off the rising anger. That's when I heard the buzzing. Low, mechanical, and invasive. A drone hovered overhead, its camera locked on my grandfather's bridge like it was casing the joint. I've worked on enough electronics to know this wasn't some kid's toy. This was industrial, survey grade, probably expensive enough to come with its own insurance plan. So I did what any self-respecting gearhead with a grudge and a good cast would do. I launched a line straight into the sky. Hook hit rotor, rotor failed physics, drone splashed into the creek like a steel duck in a shooting gallery, my koi scattered, and I reeled in the wreckage with a smirk on my face. I figured someone would come knocking. No one did. What came instead was the noise. Loud, violent, final. I woke up the next morning to chainsaws, shouts, and the crack of splintering wood. By the time I got outside, half the bridge was already gone, floating like driftwood. I screamed, waved, demanded answers. One of the men flashed a clipboard like a police badge. "Emergency HOA order, structural hazard, immediate removal." I grabbed the document, and sure enough, it had all the usual fluff. But the signature at the bottom? Victoria Caldwell in her usual royal ink. No engineer, no safety report, just a vendetta wearing lipstick and heels. And that's when it hit me. They weren't just tearing down a bridge. They were trying to erase a story. My story. My grandfather's. And in doing so, they gave me all the motivation I'd need to rewrite the ending. With one rusty valve and a whole lot of patience. I stared at that note for a long time. This especially applies to unauthorized bridges. The purple ink bled like a bruise across the page, but it wasn't the handwriting that bothered me. It was the certainty, the way she wrote it like she'd already won, like she assumed I'd fold. And maybe most folks would've. Maybe that letter was enough to scare off someone who didn't know what they were really holding. But here's the thing, she had no idea who she was dealing with. Because what she didn't see, and what was already turning gears in my head, was something that couldn't be bulldozed, fined, or surveyed. Something she'd regret missing real soon. Under the hood of my '67 Chevy, the world made sense. The metal was honest, the problems were visible, and with the right tools, the right touch, they could be solved. I liked that. I liked the rhythm of it. Oil on my hands, a socket wrench in my grip, and a classic V8 humming its way back to life. That was peace. A peace you can't fake, can't Photoshop, and certainly can't buy in a resort package. I spent my mornings listening to carburetors breathe and my evenings watching the creek ripple under a sky no one could charge admission for. That land had been in my family since the Truman administration, and every inch of it knew my name better than my bank ever did. It's funny, while I was tuning pistons, Victoria Caldwell was busy tuning perception. But what she didn't understand was that not everything polished is precious, and not everything rustic is weak. Keep that in mind, because it becomes real important later. Now let me tell you about Crystal Lake Resort. If Fakery had a showroom, this was it. Their slogan was, "Where luxury meets nature," but from where I stood it looked more like where Photoshop met landscaping. Their trees were lined up like soldiers. Their flowers bloomed in mathematically impossible symmetry, and their grass, good Lord, their grass was so green it looked like someone painted it with envy. I'm not saying you shouldn't care about aesthetics, but when your soil smells like ammonia and your koi fish float belly up before happy hour, you might want to dial it back. Meanwhile, on my side of the creek, the water was clear enough to read the date on a dropped penny. My koi? They were named after cars. Old ones. Bel Air, Thunderbird, Fairlane, swam around like royalty with no idea their neighbors were dying in chemical soup. You could say we had the same lake, but that would be like saying a hot dog stand and a steakhouse are both restaurants. The illusion was cracking, and fast. Stick around, because the first public fissure came in aisle 6 of the grocery store. It started with a voice, sharp, cold, and laced with old resentment. I was comparing cereal prices when I heard it behind me. That Monroe brat still thinks he owns the whole creek. I turned, slow and casual, and there she was. Victoria. HOA president, fashion-forward tyrant and carrier of enough passive aggression to power a small village. She wore a white blouse so crisp it could cut glass, pearls that screamed money, and those blue eyes. Icy, calculating, unmistakable. My mistake, she chirped when she saw me. Thought you was someone else. Her smile was a masterpiece, polished, perfect and utterly fake, like the rest of her empire. I nodded politely, didn't say a word. But inside, I was already checking torque levels. Because when someone hates you that fast, that quietly, it's never just about zoning rules. Trust me on that. There's always a bigger blueprint you can't see yet. The next morning it showed up, folded so tight you could bounce a quarter off it. A letter from the Crystal Lake HOA. It didn't say Dear Jake or Mr. Monroe, just resident. That was their first mistake, pretending I was anonymous on land that carried my family name. The document ran 3 pages long, with every sentence wrapped in legal wrapping paper so thick it might as well have been bubble wrap. But the message was clear, conform or else. And taped to the bottom in a shade of purple that had no business in professional ink was a handwritten note. This especially applies to unauthorized bridges. Now, my property wasn't part of their HOA. Never signed into it, never voted on it, never benefited from it. But Victoria wasn't in the business of logic, she was in the business of domination. And in her mind, a bridge she couldn't control was a bridge that shouldn't exist. But what she didn't account for was how many generations had bled, worked, and fished off that bridge. And that a man who fixes engines doesn't just roll over, especially not when history's on his side. See, that's the difference between a mechanic and a politician. We don't bluff. We don't fake the fix. When something's broken, we either fix it, replace it, or weld it into something better. We don't slap a fine on it and call it a day. Victoria thought she could break me with intimidation letters and HOA bylaws. What she didn't realize is that I've spent my life dealing with stripped bolts, seized engines, and cars that refuse to cooperate until you learn their language. Compared to that, dealing with her? Just another repair job. One with more perfume, maybe, but not much else. And if you think a purple pen was going to stop me from protecting my family's legacy, well, hang tight. Because the next move she made was a mistake worth $6 million, 0 cents. Ever get a letter that feels like it's smirking at you? That's what this was. 3 pages of weaponized legalese dressed up like community policy, signed in the same royal purple ink Victoria Caldwell probably used to endorse birthday checks or eviction threats. It started with Dear Resident, which already told me everything I needed to know. They didn't see me as Jake Monroe, 4th-generation caretaker of this land, grandson of Harold Monroe who built the bridge they just butchered. No, to them I was a line on a zoning map. The document read like a velvet rope trying to box out a legacy, full of phrases like unauthorized structure, non-compliant architectural footprint, and subject to removal under emergency authority. The part that really sang? The last line, scribbled by hand. This especially applies to your bridge. You've been warned. Signed, of course, with that same smirk of ink. Now, I could have ignored it. I could have ranted to the ceiling fan and tossed it in the burn barrel. But instead, I laid that letter on the garage counter next to a spark plug socket and really looked at it. Because in that moment, I realized something. She wasn't just trying to scare me. She was trying to erase me. That bridge wasn't just a walkway. It was proof. Proof we were here first. Proof we had roots deeper than any HOA charter, and I knew exactly why she was pushing this hard. Control. See, folks like Victoria don't want peace. They want power dressed up like order. And that letter? That was her opening salvo. She thought I was going to backpedal like a man with something to hide. But I'm a mechanic. I don't backpedal. I build torque. And what happened next proved just how out of touch she really was. The very next evening, as I was locking up the shop, I heard it. The buzz. Not a mosquito, not a hornet. This was lower, cleaner, with that whirring menace that says, "You're being watched." I stepped outside and looked up. There it was, a high-end surveying drone, floating just above the tree line like a smug little satellite, camera pointed squarely at the dock where the bridge once stood. I could practically see the price tag hovering with it. $10,000, 0 cents if it was a dime. Sleek, professional, and most definitely not flown by a neighborhood kid. No, this was HOA-grade surveillance. Eyes in the sky, probably sent to verify that the Monroe family was still daring to exist. I watched it hum in place for a moment. Then I went inside, grabbed my fishing rod, tied a new line, and stepped back out with all the calm of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Just not usually for aerial targets. You know what they say, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, and he'll eventually snag your $10,000 0 cents drone out of the sky like he's in the Bassmaster Finals. I waited for it to drift lower, like it was trying to sniff out the last remaining nail of my grandfather's bridge. Then I cast. The hook flew in a perfect arc, clipped the propeller like it was destiny, and down it went, spiraling into the creek with all the grace of a fallen angel. The splash was glorious, the koi scattered like confetti. I reeled it in slow, savoring the drag of plastic and shame through clear water. It was the most satisfying catch I'd had in years. I brought it up on the dock, water dripping from the exposed circuitry, and set it beside me like a trophy. Nobody showed up to retrieve it. No knock on the door, no apology, just silence, which said more than any fine or memo ever could. But this little fishing trip bought me something better than satisfaction. It bought me time. Because the next morning Victoria fired back. No grace period, no formal inspection, just a laminated sign staked into my driveway that read, "Emergency order. Structure must be removed within 72 hours. And underneath that, in fine print, notice delivered verbally. 6-hour compliance window effective immediately. 6 hours. That's how much time she gave me to erase my grandfather's legacy from the shoreline. Forget 72 hours, forget process, forget common decency. She cut it down to a quarter of a workday and dared me to flinch. And let me tell you, when someone who drinks imported spring water starts treating your land like it's disposable, that's when you stop playing defense and start engineering a comeback. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If the only thing standing between your heritage and a bulldozer was 6 hours and a homemade plan, then what would you do next? It was like watching a funeral happen in reverse. No flowers, no silence, just 5 strangers tearing apart my grandfather's bridge like it owed them money. They moved with the speed of people who'd done this before, clipboards in one hand and chainsaws in the other, treating 40 years of legacy like it was a sidewalk hazard. Each plank that hit the water sounded like a door slamming shut in my chest. They didn't speak to me. They didn't look at me. They just followed orders, piece by piece, until all that remained of the Monroe Bridge was driftwood and sawdust. And up on her perch, same place as always, Victoria Caldwell watched with her flute of champagne raised like she was christening a shipwreck. She didn't even pretend it was for safety. She watched it fall like she'd been waiting years for this moment. And turns out she had. When I saw that brass plaque disappear beneath the water, Hiero Monroe Memorial Bridge, est of 1982, I knew I couldn't fix this one with a wrench. That wasn't just a bridge. That was Sunday afternoons with Grandpa tying fishing knots. That was the first place I kissed someone. That was where I scattered Dad's ashes. And now it was gone, because someone with a title and a grudge decided my history was an eyesore. But grief's a funny thing. It doesn't always lead to sadness. Sometimes it ignites strategy. So I made a call to the one man who knew more about my family's past than even I did. Robert Hayes, my grandfather's old lawyer, retired, crusty, and sharp as broken glass. He didn't ask questions, just told me to come over and bring the old medal box. The one with Grandpa's handwriting on top. The one I hadn't opened in years. Robert's place hadn't changed, still smelled like cedar and dusty paperbacks, but when he opened the lid on that box, the air felt heavier, like we were pulling history out of hibernation. The first thing he laid on the table was a black and white photograph. My grandfather, in court, suit, tie, chin high. Beside him, a man in handcuffs, sour face, slicked hair, eyes like a cornered raccoon. But the real story was behind them. A teenage girl, maybe 15, arms crossed, stare sharp enough to leave scars. "That's her," I said, breath catching. "That's Victoria." Robert nodded. Back then, she was Victoria Morrison. The man in cuffs, her father. Carl Morrison? Real estate fraud, intimidation, forgery. Your grandfather put him away. Suddenly it all clicked. This wasn't zoning policy. This wasn't about a bridge. This was generational payback wearing a name badge. He inherited ravenous hatred like an heirloom, Robert said, sliding a newspaper clipping toward me. Local developer sentenced in landmark fraud case. The article read like a blueprint for every dirty tactic the HOA had pulled in the past 6 months, only now it had a face and a motive. Her father lost everything. Their family went from gated luxury to government-subsidized housing overnight. And while her mother moved on, Victoria apparently chose vengeance as her major in life. She married rich, changed her name, and waited. Waited until the Johnson property next to us went up for sale. Waited until the resort broke ground. Waited until she could build her kingdom just close enough to tear mine down. All those bylaws she passed, the expansion of HOA boundaries, none of it was accidental. She'd spent 30 years sharpening this blade, and now I was bleeding for something my grandfather did right. But Robert wasn't finished. From a folder yellowed at the edges, he pulled out a legal document that looked unremarkable until you read the title, Water Rights Certificate, Crystal Creek Watershed, 1948. I stared at it, heart thumping like I'd just found buried treasure. My great-grandfather, Harold's dad, had secured full legal control of the entire creek system before the resort even existed. Every gallon that flowed through that lake ran through our land first. Which meant one thing: Victoria didn't just destroy a bridge, she destroyed the evidence standing above her resort's only water source. "Knowledge is power," Robert said, tapping the paper. "And this is a pipe wrench to the knees." I felt something shift then, not just anger, but resolve. She thought she held the leash. Turns out she'd built her glass castle on a stream I owned, and I was about to show her how fast it could flood. So now let me ask you, what do you think one rusty valve and a forgotten water rights clause can do to a multi-million-dollar resort built on revenge? Stay with me, because what happens next, it's where the whole game flips. Most folks go to war with lawyers or lawsuits. Me? I went to war with a '65 Chevy Radiator, 3 feet of PVC pipe, and a rusty valve pulled from an old well pump. My buddy Sam Ortiz, plumber by trade, philosopher by accident, showed up with duct tape and a level and said, "We're either building a water traffic light or the world's saddest science fair project." I just smiled. We both knew what we were doing. Using old-school mechanics and a little backyard wizardry, we engineered a fully legal flow control system. Nothing fancy, just smart. It didn't block the resort's water entirely, that'd be illegal, but it did redirect priority access through my side of the creek. Their 5-star spa still got water, just not when I was filling troughs, washing engines, or brushing my teeth. Think of it as a slow drip reminder. You built on borrowed water, and now the bill was due. Meanwhile, Victoria was busy trying to look independent. I got a text from Sam one morning with a photo that said it all. Massive drilling rigs parked outside the resort, all staged to announce her new self-sufficient water plan. It was rich, literally. Drilling a well out here costs more than a brand new truck. But what made me laugh wasn't the rigs. It was the location, right smack in a zone labeled on the old geological map Robert gave me as salt water intrusion risk high. That meant if they hit anything at all, it'd be water you couldn't boil into tea, let alone fill a koi pond. I shook my head. It was like watching someone buy a Ferrari and drive it into a frozen lake, then act surprised when it sank. The best part? She'd done it all on camera. Every investor, every board member, every social media wellness influencer had a front row seat. By day 4 of drilling, they still hadn't hit anything but wet disappointment. I'd walk out to the dock in the mornings, coffee in hand, and just listen to the hollow clank of million-dollar failure. Then, on day 6, it happened. One of the workers hit a pocket, and for about 30 seconds they celebrated like they'd discovered gold until someone tested it. The way I heard it, the conversation went quiet real fast. Salt water. Straight from the earth's sarcastic sense of humor. I could see Victoria pacing from across the creek, her heels sinking into the fresh mud like karma itself was dragging her down. You can't run a luxury spa with water that tastes like regret and rust. They spent $50 grand to drill a straw into the ocean, and I hadn't lifted a finger. That's the thing about revenge. It's better served slow and with receipt. The fallout was digital and delicious. A guest at the resort posted a TikTok showing koi fish flopping on the marble lobby floor, followed by a pan to Victoria shouting at maintenance workers. The caption, "Crystal Lake Spa or Seafood Market? Swamp King?" That hashtag caught fire. Within hours, people were memeing me like I was some outlaw folk hero with a pipe wrench. Sam started calling me Moses, claiming I parted the water budget. I didn't care about the attention. I cared that her foundation was cracking, literally and publicly. What started as quiet payback had gone viral, and there was no PR team big enough to mop up what was coming. The more they posted, the more curious the public got. And when someone asked why the resort didn't just use their own water, the internet started doing what it does best: digging. See, sometimes the best weapon isn't a lawsuit or a protest. Sometimes it's a rusty valve, a fishing hook, and the patience to let arrogance do the demolition for you. Victoria thought she could bury history with bylaws and fine print. What she didn't count on was a couple of mechanics with a long memory and an old map. But she wasn't done, not by a long shot. Word around town was she was planning a full-court press at the investor gala the following weekend, and champagne, speeches, drone footage, one big glamorous lie wrapped in hors d'oeuvres. She was betting everything on that event to save face and maybe, just maybe, secure new capital to outrun the swampy truth. And that's where I started planning my next move. Because if she thought a few soggy rugs were the end of this war, she was about to learn what desperation really looks like when it shows up in heels and a soaked foundation. What could go wrong next? You're about to find out. It was supposed to be her grand comeback. Champagne towers, drone tours, violin quartets under string lights. But nature had other plans, and this time, she couldn't blame the creek. The night before the big investor gala, Victoria Caldwell did what vindictive people always do when they think no one's watching. She got sloppy. See, I'd publicly surrendered, made a post about shutting down the garage, selling the property, moving on, said I was tired of the fight and ready to cooperate with the HOA for the good of the community. Sam played his part, too, stormed out of the hardware store the next day, yelling that I was a coward and Grandpa would have disowned me. It was Oscar-worthy. We made it loud enough for the security cams to catch every word, just in case Victoria needed proof I'd given up. And wouldn't you know it, that very night, at exactly 2:43 a.m., she showed up on my land with a sledgehammer and a flashlight, and she went to town. The security camera, borrowed from a Tesla parked in my cousin's garage, caught it all in crisp, unforgiving 4K. Victoria, in her HOA hoodie and garden gloves, smashing my flow control valve to pieces. She muttered while she worked. "No more games," she hissed, mid-swing. "This time, that Monroe boy is finished." Irony is a beautiful thing. She thought she was silencing me, but all she did was uncork chaos. That valve didn't just regulate the flow, it stabilized pressure across the entire lower creek. Without it, the water didn't just slow down, it built up, swelled, and by morning, found its own path. That path led straight into Crystal Lake Resort's lowest foundation point. The luxury lobby became an indoor koi pond. Persian rugs turned into sea sponges. Marble floors cracked like cheap vinyl under 3 feet of brown, silty water. Her empire sank faster than the lobby carpets. Investors arrived in black Escalades, only to find staff wading through what used to be the welcome center. The Champagne Tower never even got unboxed. A guest's viral live stream showed Victoria, standing in a soaked Versace gown, mascara streaking like storm runoff, screaming into her phone, while a koi flopped near her ankle. Social media crowned her the Swamp Queen before noon, but the real reckoning came later that day, inside the community hall, when Robert Hayes stood up with a manila folder thick enough to choke a printer. Inside, 6 months' worth of HOA emails, texts, and handwritten notes. Every threat, every forged signature, every personal grudge dressed up as policy. One email read, "If we can't get him to comply, we'll bury him in fines until he breaks." Another, "The Monroe Bridge has to go. I don't care how we spin it." The board voted 127-3 to remove her as HOA president. The 3 who voted in her favor, all resigned the next morning. Then came the surprise no one expected. Margaret Shen, newly elected and deeply apologetic, showed up at my garage with 2 things, a check and a promise. The check was for $500,000, 0 cents. Compensation for damages, harassment, and legal costs. But the promise? That was worth more. The HOA would rebuild the Monroe Memorial Bridge plank for plank, using my grandfather's original blueprints, and they wouldn't do it quietly. They invited the community to help. Retired vets showed up with tool belts, teenagers brought pizza and paintbrushes, even a few resort guests wandered over to lend a hand, curious about the real history behind the scandal they'd seen online. Watching that bridge go up again didn't just feel like redemption. It felt like resurrection. It was proof that sometimes you can reclaim what's been stolen, and that even damage done in bad faith can be undone in good. By the time the last nail was hammered in, something had shifted. Not just in me, but in the whole town. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were cracking jokes over paint cans. Former enemies were handing each other wood screws. And as I stood on the newly rebuilt bridge, looking across the water at a resort still drying out, I realized something my grandfather had probably known all along. Bridges aren't just for crossing water, they're for connecting people, even ones who once stood on opposite shores. And if you think this story ends here, well, let's just say the final twist is still on its way. You'll want to hear what happened when she came back. As I stood on that rebuilt bridge, hands on the same handrails my grandfather once carved with calloused fingers, I realized this story wasn't about a resort or a rusty valve or even revenge. It was about holding the line when the world tells you to give up. It was about remembering that not everything worth fighting for comes with a price tag. Sometimes the real wealth is knowing where you come from and refusing to let anyone pave over it for profit. I didn't just rebuild a bridge. I rebuilt dignity, plank by plank, in front of a town that finally remembered what community actually means. This story taught me, and maybe you too, that sometimes the strongest resistance isn't a punch, it's patience. It's not about tearing someone down, it's about standing tall when they expect you to fold. Victoria used power like a weapon. I used it like a lever. And when the dust and the flood settled, one truth rose above the waterline. When you've got legacy, purpose, and just enough stubbornness to weld scraps into strategy, you're already richer than anyone hiding behind bylaws and fountains. If this story made you feel something, made you laugh, made you think, made you look at that old family photo a little differently, then do me a favor, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Tap that like button if you believe legacy matters more than luxury, and hit subscribe, because the next story, let's just say I haven't even told you what happened when Victoria came back and asked for a job. You won't want to miss that. Before you go, what do you want to hear next? Do you want more wild HOA stories, legal loophole comebacks, or maybe tales about quiet folks who flip the script on power-hungry neighbors? Drop your ideas in the comments below. Seriously, I read every one. Your suggestions help shape the next episode, and who knows, your story idea might just be the next one we bring to life. If today's story made you laugh, think, or cheer a little inside, like, comment, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Trust me, we're just getting started.